Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our joint seminar series co-hosted by the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies and the UCLA Center for the Study of International Migration. My name is David Fitzgerald and I'm glad you're joining us today to discuss migration and inequality. Before I introduce the panelists, here's a quick programming note. On February 11th at this hour, we'll be discussing the new book by Andrea Wright titled Between Dreams and Ghosts, Indian Migration and Middle Eastern Oil. You can find information about that February 11th event, as well as all of our events at the websites of the co-sponsoring centers. But in today's panel, we welcome back Mirna Safi. She is Associate Professor of Sociology at Sciences Po, and she'll be presenting her book, Migration and Inequality, recently published by Polity Press. Our discussant today is Andrés Villarreal, Professor of Sociology at UCLA. I should also note that he is an alumnus of the UCSD program in Latin American Studies. So welcome back to you as well, Andrés. The order of activities today is that Mirna Safi will give about a 30-minute overview of the book. We'll then have a 10-minute or so discussion, comment by Andrés Villarreal. Mirna will briefly respond, and then we'll open it up to a discussion with everyone on the call today. If you'd like to pose a question, please electronically raise your hand and you'll be unmuted to ask your question live, or you can put your question into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will report that to the author. So without further ado, we will welcome Professor Safi and thank her for joining us on what should be a relaxing Friday night in Paris, but she is with us and we're anxious to learn more about your book. Please.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, David. And thanks a lot also to Roger for the invitation. I'm also very grateful to Professor Villarreal for having accepted to discuss the book. And I was telling David that actually I didn't get the chance to present this book very much. So really, I'm very happy because it appeared just in the midst of the beginning of the pandemics. And actually, I didn't travel to present it in any case. So I'm really happy for this opportunity and also happy to be back to Los Angeles in a way, but remotely. So what I'll try to do today is to, of course, to present the book, but maybe I won't like extensively present it. I'll start presenting briefly the overall structure of the book and the take-home messages, let's say, and then I'll try to add in this presentation some of my ongoing empirical work that connects to the theoretical framework that I try to sketch in the book. So we'll see. I have a couple of papers that I would want to show you very briefly, just as to give you some ideas of my current work that connect to the book. Let's start first with the book itself. So what I try to do in this book is actually to connect migration in a way to the sociological tradition of social stratification studies. And more precisely, I try to bridge the gap between three different literatures that I got the chance to explore somehow during my career: migration studies and international migration studies in particular, ethnic and racial studies, and social inequality studies. I try to really be very comprehensive and somehow multi-paradigmatic and let's say, perspective in the book, as I use different approaches, multidimensional approaches to social inequality. I mean here the fact that I use both structural and cultural, and also multi-level, in the sense that I use some work that focuses on the micro or the meso or the macro level of analysis. And I try to be analytical in a way to really disentangle the different channels through which migration is related to social inequality. And also what I try to do is to cover these issues using really broad interdisciplinary literature. And maybe, of course, I mean, I'm not exhaustive in using the literature, and I just use the literature that, you know, to the extent to which I've already met with these studies. But I think from the perspective of maybe students on these issues, what the book tries to do is to really, it's interesting maybe in this book to see work from sociology, because I'm a sociologist, of course, but also from economics, political science, social psychology, history, and etc. So first, the book actually starts trying to define international migrants, and I use this kind of basic notion, and just to maybe challenge a bit you know, the extent to which this definition is really not straightforward, and it has some kind of controversial aspect, and even you know, contentious, let's say, connotations in terms of political contention. I mean here, and I give some examples about the extent to which the foreign-born definition is not always satisfactory, and in some countries in particular where we have some kind of return colonial migrants, as it's the case in France in particular, but also in other countries where we have wide internal migration as well. And I try to stress that actually, in that sense, immigration is really interesting as a category of inequality. I mean, immigrant is an interesting category of inequality in contemporary migration societies, because it's a category of inequality that is ascriptive in the sense that it's based on a birthplace criterion, and it's durable because it never changes. And somehow migrants can become, sometimes they live even, you know, a longer period in the host country than in their birthplace country, but still they will still be migrants somehow. And it's transmittable, since actually we keep studying the you know, the different generations stemming from migration. In France now, we are reaching in representative surveys the third generation, and I know that it's even more the case in the US. So this has really implications in terms of the relation to social inequality in societies that are committed to egalitarian ideologies, at least, and sometimes egalitarian laws and political frame. So this is really my starting point, and I argue that we have to think about really the connections between migration and social inequality in a unified theoretical framework. What I try to do is first, actually, I spent some time just let's say, reviewing somehow the literature on social inequality. I don't claim here any kind of intrinsic contribution to the field, but the main idea was that I wanted to have some kind of a simplified model of social inequality that I can use somehow to figure out and to analyze the extent, I mean, how migration can shake this system of social inequality, or how it can affect it. And so I mainly use actually this classic distinction in social stratification studies between categorization and distribution of resources. I try to also, of course, argue that if you want to connect migration to social inequality, I mean, let's say the core social stratification studies tend to be very much nation state centered, and that we need to, we need to have a global perspective if you want to incorporate migration in this literature. And then what I do is to actually really delineate three questions that can summarize somehow current approaches to social inequality. Inequality of what? Inequality between whom? And how inequality works. And I use these questions as a way actually to connect migration to social inequality. To be clearer here, actually I disentangle between three channels. So the economic, the legal, and the ethno-racial channel. And I argue that migration affects actually these three channels through three forms of categorization processes: the division of labor in the economic channel, formal membership in the legal channel, and symbolic membership in the ethno-racial channel. And within each channel, I argue that migrants constitute actually different categories of workers in the economic channel, of citizens in the legal channel, and of human in the ethno-racial channel, and that these categorization can actually affect the inequality of the unequal distribution of resources. And so I start with the economic channel, and I'm not going to now expand very much. In each chapter, then you will have really like a literature review actually based on my reading of the literature that relates to each channel. So I start with the economic channel, where I discuss actually mainly the literature from political economy and the idea that the global approach to inequality from a political economy perspective thinks about migration as connected to the international division of labor. And I also use the literature from labor economics and the effect of migration on the host country's labor market, including earnings of natives, but also the distinction between the low and the high skilled. And I also use somehow the more sociological research on earnings and wage gap between migrants and natives, to think about this specifically economic channel that really I connect to the labor market. But at the end of the chapter, I also discuss the extent to which this channel is not completely autonomous. And I give some examples. I consider that, like, for instance, post-World War European guest workers migration is a very important example that highlights the importance of the economic channel, and contemporary care workers migration is also a very good example in this regard. And then I move to the legal one. So maybe I won't expand too much now. If you got the idea, and I look forward to maybe to the discussion to discuss more in depth the book. But actually, yeah, there are different chapters. The legal channel is really developed in with this idea that we have the World Polity Organization context that systematically classifies the planet's inhabitants in a way in a nation state citizens, and that in that context actually migration gives rise to legal and administrative process of human categorizations that at the same time also distribute unequal rights. And I discuss in this chapter in particular the ways in which we can actually unmake these categories through what I call D and recategorization, for instance, change in citizenship, or the effect of immigration policies, for instance, EU reforms in migration, etc. And finally, maybe the most complicated channel is the ethno-racial one. And here I tend to think about it really using mainly the US literature. That's true, because actually this is where we find actually the most prolific literature in a sense. But I also in this chapter tend to use multi-level approaches, and tend to think about group boundary dynamics also. I mean, again, I use a lot of work, it's not mine, but multi-level global approaches to group boundary dynamics, and here the idea is really to discuss how migrants can arrive to societies where we have existing ethno-racial classification, and how actually they can affect and reshape and reconfigure these classifications, or sometimes they can completely, in a sense, be subject to these classification. And so I use this also literature from the ethnic and racial studies field to consider this channel. Okay, so now I'll stop in terms of the presentation of the book, and actually I wanted to maybe make the most of this seminar today to also show you some of my ongoing work, because also actually I had the chance to get a very instructive and constructive critique actually of my book. And I think three main critique for the moment that I received. The first one is related to the fact that the book does not really elaborate on empirical works. Again, not mine, at least. I use a lot actually of empirical studies, but I don't really develop myself my theoretical framework with the use of empirical work. And so this is why I'll show you some. And the second was that I really maybe separate too much in the book the three channels, and these channels are very much intertwined and related. And so I'll try to give you an example from a paper which can connect somehow the legal and the ethno-racial channel. So I'm sorry, I'm going to be, in a way, it's not very standard presentation. I'm not going to go into the details of the papers. I have here 3 papers actually that I'm going to use sporadically somehow in the presentation. I will try the most possible actually to give you the intuition of the research design and the research question and a flavor of the results, just in a way to illustrate a little bit my framework. So first, in terms of the economic channel, I argue in the book that most, at least in labor economics, most of the research focuses on the effect of migration on natives, wages, different outcomes, sometimes also on economic growth, in particular with this idea that migrants arrive and it's a shock on the economy and things will change. And actually, most of this literature has a lot of, uses a lot of methodological sophistication and find very small effect. And I try to, I mean, with other colleagues, we really think that an interesting approach is to focus on the workplaces themselves as the locus of what actually migrant labor can, how migrant labor can affect the labor market. And so I refer here to some work I've been conducting within an international comparative group using linked employer-employee dataset, exhaustive linked employer-employee dataset in 15 countries, OECD countries, where we have really harmonized the data in a way to compare wage inequality in these countries. And we focus on, in a paper that we've published in 2020 on the decomposition between the within and the workplace inequality. And I'll show you now mostly some of, of ongoing research that focus on the French case in particular and on the role of migrant work in the labor market. So in this paper that we've been trying to write right now with Olivier Gautreau and Matthew Sonner, we look at, it's very descriptive, okay, and we look just at the trends in terms of the decomposition of the between and the within inequality, within workplace inequality. So here we're using wages, and what you can notice already is that we have like this kind of striking difference in the patterns when you look at workplaces where you have high migrants, and here we measure high migrant by workplaces that have more than the median level of migrant, but you'll see in my next slides that actually wherever the threshold that you use, you will see this kind of pattern that actually most of the between workplace inequality is driven in France in particular by those workplaces where you have the most, actually the highest share of migrants. What you could notice also is that the within earning inequality within workplace, inequality is also higher in these actually workplaces with migrants are more numerous. And you could argue here that it's mostly a compositional effect. But in any case, this is by itself telling us that actually migrants tend to work in high inequality workplaces, in workplaces where actually between inequality is higher, and also in workplaces in which within inequality is higher. Now we compute also the contribution actually of high migrant workplaces to the overall increase in between establishment workplaces and inequality, in France, and it's quite substantive. So here the idea is that, okay, we see clearly that migrants seem to work in very, specific workplaces where inequality tends to be very high, and we, in the second step, we ask whether actually inequality in these workplaces is consistently high across different categories of inequality. And here, for instance, in the dataset in France in particular, we are able to compare class, and here based mainly on occupational divide, between managers and workers, gender, and migration status. And we ask whether actually different forms of wage inequalities how they relate to one another at the workplace level. And do we observe consistent levels of inequality in the sense that each workplace would be like an inequality regime, to use Acker's expression? Or is it that we would measure some kind of opposition, substitution, compensation dynamics between these different inequalities? So I won't go through the methodological aspects that are really very, in this case, quite challenging, because we are really measuring these issues at the workplace level. So we are trying to clean up the wage gaps from all the compositional, individual and workplace compositional effects. And we're looking at the correlation, if you want, once you really the correlation of the residual, if you want, at the workplace level. And what we find is actually a very interesting pattern here. Really, it's again controlling for individual and workplaces characteristics. And we find a very consistent pattern of a negative correlation between the gender gap and the migrant status gap. This correlation is really consistent all over the period of observation here from 1996 to 2016. While correlations of the residual here between the class gap and the migrant status, for instance, tends to be of lesser magnitude, and also actually maybe actually it's not significant in that case on average. And class and gender tend to be negatively correlated, but very the magnitude of the correlation is very small in comparison to nativity and gender. So the important pattern is that nativity, migrant status here has really a negative correlation with each of these two different categories. And I didn't mention the third one, which is actually a gradient type measure of earning inequality here, controlling for these categories. So something that we actually interpret as productivity measures that we don't have, unobservables that we don't have in the data, that can be related to soft skills, etc. So we discuss in the paper our findings using a lot of speculation about the reasons why we have this kind of patterns, but I don't have maybe a lot of time, because I want also to give you some of the results related to the last paper. But really here, the main maybe message is that migrant status seems to come with compensatory oppositional inequality dynamics at the workplace level. We need really to delve further into this to understand what is happening, and the use of longitudinal data here is very important, and we've been doing so, trying to do so with French data, for instance, to see at the workplace level how the change in the migrant population will affect the female workforce and females' earnings, for instance, in these firms. Okay, now a few words about the legal and the ethno-racial channel. I'm sorry, maybe it's a bit complicated, because most of you maybe are not very familiar with the French case, but I'll try to make it intuitive again. Here, what we're looking at with Haley McAvin and Louise Caron is basically self-declaration of individual in the French census. And maybe some of you know that in France, we don't have any kind of ethno-racial identification in statistical and public statistic data, but we actually rely mostly on what we call citizenship categorization. And in the French census, the question actually is very peculiar in a sense, because so I know most of you don't read French, so I'll explain to you. It uses a question with three categories. It's a question about your nationality, but you could actually say that you are French either by birth or French by acquisition. So a French by birth is somebody who is born French, okay, with the French nationality. It doesn't mean that the person is born in France. Could be that the person is born abroad, but with the French nationality, because of the fact that at least one parent had the French nationality at birth. And the French nationality law is very complicated. It's not, strictly speaking, a jus soli law. So just here, what you need to understand is that we have two different categories of French people here. Some are French by birth and some other are naturalized French, okay? And then you have also all these foreigners that are not French yet, in a sense. And so what we do in the study is that we use longitudinal data. And here we're really tracking the same individuals over time across different censuses. And we see, and what we see is that actually people change their self-reported citizenship in a quite peculiar, surprising, and even inconsistent way from a legal perspective. Just to be clear here, so if you think about, so we look actually at two dates, so two subsequent dates in the census, and we have a long period from 1968 to 2008. And if you take the example of a person who said at the time T that he or she became French, which means that they are French by acquisition. So these people are of foreign origin. So you should expect them to actually declare again in the subsequent sample that census, that they still became French. And actually we see that some of them will actually say that they became French by birth, which is something that couldn't be, again, legally possible. And we call this reclassification. Of course, we see this also for foreigners. For foreigners, it's a kind of more complicated because at one stage they can indeed become French or stay foreigners, but they would never become French by birth, right? And so we're focusing in this paper on these kind of transition. To what extent people actually, what does it mean? So first, what we show, I'm not going to go into declass, but we also see these kind of complicated, let's say, declassification, but we show in the paper that these are very rare, while actually reclassification, so the upward transitions are quite important. So we focus on these transitions. And what we try to show in the paper is that they are meaningful in the sense that we have really, they are meaningful in comparison, for instance, with the declassification patterns. They are frequent, they are consistent over the period, so, and sticky. So in a sense, they never change, but if you change the period of observation, the magnitude of the frequency of these transitions is roughly the same. And they are, that once people actually change, so become, declare they are French by birth, this transition is sticky. And we then actually delve into the mechanisms using mainly the assimilation literature and the ethno-racial reconfiguration literature. And here, really, I think maybe just to connect back to the book, I think this example clearly shows that the legal categorization somehow are a way, I mean, a field of struggle also for the migrant population, but that they have also this kind of ethno-racial dimension, or at least identity dimension. It could be that migrants feel like that the French by birth category is the best category somehow, and at one time after having spent a certain time in the host country, everybody would aspire to become somehow French by birth. And it's interesting because in France, actually, let's say, public statistics have been really struggling and avoiding ethno-racial categorization because mainly of the fact that people can instrumentalize them, etc. And this example shows that even what we could think about as like formal, clearly defined categories can still be used by migrants in a way to recategorize in host societies. Okay, so I'll try now a conclusion. I hope I'm not, I didn't use too much of the time. Yeah, I'm not very good at conclusions, but of course, I mean, I tried in this presentation to present the book and also present some of my ongoing work that relates somehow to the book. Mainly what I tried to argue in my book is that migration is a case study for inequality, but doesn't mean that migration is by itself and all the time producing inequality. On the contrary, what I show in the book and also in the works that I've shown you today is that there are heterogeneity and open-ended outcomes that we have to take into account. And that mainly the main take-home message is that we really have to pay attention to the categorization dynamic that are actually provoked by migration. And we have to pay attention to these categories in particular, where they are produced, how they are produced, what kind of symbolic hierarchies do they actually convey, and how they are perceived and used in claim making by individuals themselves. And also one additional, maybe last critique that I will mention that some also pointed while reading my book is that it doesn't have really very concrete policy implication. And this is something completely true. So I'll be working on this in the future, I hope, but maybe just one direction, I think, is the fact that, at least for European people, I think it's very clear that today we're using migration and migrant as a category that is close to an idea of ethno-racial minority. And so when we speak about, for instance, anti-discrimination policy, we refer to migrant status, etc. And we tend to have this kind of conflation between migration and ethnicity and race. And I think actually thinking about migration and the extent to which it plays a role in inequality dynamics will also have some kind of consequences on the ways in which we distinguish in our policies what actually pertains to migration and what pertains to actually ethnic and racial relation or equal opportunity policies. So yeah, I know this is quite vague for the moment, but I'm trying to think about these implications as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mirna. We'll turn it over now to Andrés.
All right, let me share my screen. Okay, you can see that. I may have to read some extensively from my notes. I want to make sure I get things right. There's a lot of parts to the book. First of all, it was a real pleasure to read Mirna's book and to comment on it. It's a really a sort of ambitious theoretical synthesis of relating the literature on international migration and inequality, which she defines in broad terms. Migration and equality are also two of my own research interests. And so for that reason, I found myself particularly engaged with it and found a lot of the discussion very useful. In particular, I was really impressed with the sheer volume and broad range of literature she draws on. It's really masterful. She draws on a vast amount of research in economics, political science, sociology, law, everything. In fact, I counted in her reference section in her book is over 40 pages long. It tells you a little bit about how much she's able to absorb and incorporate. It's really impressive. Most of us working on immigration, myself included, we work on a specific socioeconomic outcome, or we work on a particular immigrant population, and I myself work on immigrants' economic assimilation, earnings assimilation in the U.S., and it's easy for me to sort of lose the big picture of things, and so I welcome Mirna's book. It forced me to really think more broadly than I usually do about the effects of immigration on inequality. I would particularly appreciate several features of her theoretical framework, and I don't want to dwell too much on them, but I do want to highlight those. First, I found that distinction between the three different channels through which migration affects inequality to be really useful. She calls it the economic, legal, and ethno-racial channel, although I did have the same observation that Mirna noted earlier, that there could be maybe more attention on the interrelation between those different channels. The second thing is I appreciated her broad definition of inequality. Most of us tend to define it based on a distribution of resources, but she also talks about the inequality in legal and political status and moral worth and respect, and these are sort of important dimensions that are often overlooked. And then finally, I appreciated really especially her explicit modeling of the mutual relation between categorization of immigrants by legal and ethno-racial status on the one hand, and then the distribution of resources on the other. She says that inequality cannot be understood without the process of categorization of immigrants, and I fully agree with that. It's a really a point well taken. So despite all these wonderful things, I really admire the book. I do have some friendly criticisms, and I should note here that when he asked me to discuss the book, Roger warned me that this is he said this is an author meets critic session, not a flattering session. He said so. So it's in that spirit that I bring up some of these points that maybe she can address or elaborate on. I should note first that it's hard to critique a book like Mirna's because it's not an empirical research project. It doesn't mean to be, and so in an empirical work, one can go in there and challenge the empirical assumptions or the methods and measurements and get into it, or the conclusions drawn from the analysis, whether they're warranted or not. Instead, her book really is more a synthesizes a vast amount of studies and presents a potentially really useful framework. So it's harder to criticize it on those empirical grounds, let's say. I would also say it's hard to criticize the theoretical framework because the book outlines the many different ways that immigration may lead to inequality, but says a little bit less about what factors specifically are more important in generating that inequality. And so that was my first overall point, that although the theory she presents is exceptionally thorough in identifying the various ways, the various mechanisms in which migration affects inequality, it sometimes seemed to me that the thoroughness got in the way of making specific claims. At times I thought there was sort of more emphasis in itemizing all possible ways, all possible configurations in which migration could lead to say a reconfiguration of ethno-racial categories, then a discussion about exactly under what conditions would we expect certain ethno-racial reconfigurations to occur or inequality to increase. In other words, I sometimes felt that the theory described well what can happen under different conditions, but was not sufficiently predictive. As an empirical researcher, what I most look for in a theory is what it will predict under different circumstances. So for example, with regards to the third channel, the ethno-racial channel connecting migration and inequality, you conclude that sometimes immigrants fit into the existing ethno-racial categories, while other times they potentially destabilize or reshape the racial order, but you never quite distill the set of conditions under which one outcome will occur and not the other. So I was wondering maybe you could elaborate on that a little more. And so relatedly, which factors do we prioritize when thinking about inequality and under different contexts? It's something I'll mention in a minute. My own work, as I said, deals specifically with what you call the economic channel, and I was really impressed with the way you synthesize that literature in sociology and economics, and I learned a lot from it. You draw, in particular here, from the work of Charles Tilly, who famously looked at categorical inequality and argued that it can result from a process of either exploitation or opportunity hoarding. And so you sort of outlined that. However, I felt that this distinction still leaves things at a very high level of abstraction. There are multiple ways in which opportunity hoarding could lead to inequality due to migration, and it's important through which mechanism it occurs, and it's important for policy reasons, but also to get to the bottom of what's causing it. And I suspect these mechanisms vary by societal context, something I'll get to in a minute. So, for example, some have argued that, let's say, take segregation. Some have argued it's the linchpin of racial inequality in the U.S. I'm thinking of Doug Massey here. But others argue that ethnic enclaves can be beneficial under certain circumstances. And so I was wondering how important you think things like, like segregation is as a form of opportunity hoarding. And similarly, education is another form of opportunity hoarding. Access to education and high quality education could be limited for immigrants and their children. and a lot of people have made, have discussed education in the context of immigration. And so I was wondering how important is that as a mechanism of exclusion and opportunity hoarding. And then finally, similar exclusion from the labor market. I think your current research that you just summarized for us maybe starts to get at that. How important is that? Is that the primary mechanism? And how do these different mechanisms of opportunity hoarding or exploitation vary in different contexts? And that leads me to another point. Throughout the book, you have a lot of really interesting observations from different contexts, and you draw a lot from the U.S. experience, and you mention in the book that that's partly because there's such a rich literature of studies on immigration in the U.S. and there are really good sources of data and so on. But you also draw extensively from the European context, particularly in France, but also in other contexts and other national contexts. And so I was wondering, if you could synthesize what you think are the main differences between these two contexts that you know well, and particularly how the differences in how in immigration leads to inequality may vary precisely through the channels you identify. So in the economic channel, there's of course a large differences in labor markets and the educational systems that could play a role. In the legal channel, of course, the way that immigrants are categorized as refugees or the laws regarding the birthright to citizenship and so on, and undocumented status in the U.S. also could play a role. And finally, in the ethno-racial channel, the work, I'm thinking here of the work of Richard Alba in particular, who famously argued that the distinction between Muslim immigrants and others in Europe resemble more bright boundaries or hard boundaries that were harder to cross, whereas he described the ethno-racial boundary between Mexican immigrants and others in the U.S. as a more of a blurred boundary, although he did leave open the possibility that the race was a harder boundary in the U.S. as well. Anyway, so I'm just wondering if you could say more about the difference in these two settings and how your framework helps us understand and what they would predict for the future of inequality, given the framework you present us. And then somewhat relatedly, and you sort of already alluded to that, someone else has also made this point before. I think you do have observations on policies scattered throughout the book, but I was wondering if you could maybe synthesize a little more about what you think the role of policies are in generating inequality and how they act through the three channels you mentioned. So in the economic channel, policies governing labor markets, as maybe your current research emphasizes, or retirement systems could really make a difference. In the legal channel, you do discuss the way that immigrants are categorized will matter tremendously, of course. And in the ethno-racial channel, government policies can either strengthen or weaken ethno-racial boundaries. And so I was wondering how important you think different policies are in explaining national differences, and how important these policies are related to other factors that I mentioned earlier. One thing I thought wasn't sufficiently emphasized in your theoretical in your account, and I guess relates to my own research, is the multi-generational aspect of immigrant assimilation or incorporation. And I was wondering if you could comment on that a bit more. So in your book, you focus mostly on the first generation, and empirically, I guess it makes some sense given the large foreign-born population in the U.S. and in Europe. But in the long run, what happens to the second and later generations will matter more for the perpetuation of inequality and have more long-lasting effects. And I was wondering again whether how this would operate through the different channels you mentioned. For example, in the legal channel, I was thinking of the work by Frank Bean and Susan Brown and others who have argued that undocumented status in the U.S. Has a consequences for children and even for grandchildren. So it's something that can be sort of inherited. The effects can be inherited through generations. And on the ethno-racial channel, what's more important in the long run than how the first generation is categorized is how the second generation perceives themselves and are categorized by others. So a lot of research has shown that the second generation identifies differently from the first. They either absorb the racial categorization in the U.S. or they actually react against it or whatever. So anyway, I was just thinking about how the multi-generational effect would act through these different channels you mentioned. Another question I had, which is admittedly out of the scope of your research, so it's asking a lot, but it seemed that your research was more concentrated on the effects of migration on inequality in receiving countries in Europe and the US. But I was wondering about how it generates inequality in sending countries, and specifically whether it could act through the same channels you identify. So clearly, the selective receiving of remittances in sending countries, like families who have migrants versus families who don't, can generate or areas of the country have received remittances and those who don't can generate inequalities. But I was wondering through the different channels whether we could understand what would happen in sending countries. I would imagine that the economic channel is more important. The legal channel, it's possible that that immigrants could lose their citizenship or citizenship rights in their sending countries, and therefore they lose access to healthcare, retirement, and so on if they were to return. And I'm also thinking here of this literature that talks about not only economic remittances, but they're called social and political remittances, ways in which transnational communities, or specifically immigrants living in the US or Europe, can affect political change back home, and the distribution of power in that way. So anyway, I was wondering whether your framework can help us understand that a little bit. And then finally, I couldn't help but ask you under this context, how you think the COVID epidemic may affect inequality as it relates to immigrants. I've been doing some work with a graduate student in our department, looking at immigrants, how immigrants fared during the COVID epidemic, and we found so far that they were affected more economically, particularly specifically in regards to employment, but the effect seems to be limited to the initial months of the epidemic, and so it seems to wane after that. But I was wondering whether we could understand how the COVID epidemic may affect inequality precisely through the three channels you identify. So on the one hand, COVID may lead to, say, the hardening of legal boundaries, and in greater sort of hardening of barriers against undocumented immigrants and those without full citizenship rights. And then on the ethno-racial channel, I'm wondering whether COVID is leading to or will lead to further stigmatization of certain immigrant groups as being the culprits of the epidemic, or bringing the epidemic, or aggravating the epidemic, as we saw with regards to Asian immigrants and Asian Americans in the U.S. during the past years. Anyway, so I know there's a lot, and some of it I think repeats some of the stuff you say you've received from others, but I hope these comments are useful. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Andrés. That's a lot of very important questions on the table. Mirna, maybe you could just pick out a couple of responses, and then we'll open it up to the group.
Thanks very much. Really, these were very, very interesting questions. So I'll try to pick some. Maybe just to begin with the COVID, I don't really have. I mean, we did some studies in France on the pandemics, but it wasn't really. I mean, we didn't have enough of migrants in our sample because the sample was quite small. But I would say that I would think about it a little bit differently from. I mean, complementary to what you've said, just in terms of the effect of how I see the relation between migration and the pandemic is also related to the very, very important decrease in travel all over the world, and the fact that actually international migration dropped very sharply during the pandemic, just because actually people were really, could not move somehow. And in that sense, it's a huge constraint on human mobility, and in that sense, it's a huge also effect on well-being. Okay, right? And in terms of our approach of, this idea of the relation to inequality, it's very interesting, because when you look at finally at the effects of these constraints and the fact that all nation states decided to close to prevent migrants to come, and also to prevent transnational travel in general, supposedly to be really accelerating the pandemic, was that actually when we look now at the figure, now that things are getting back to normal to some extent, we see that actually the structural factors are still there, and so we have here high cost on all those that could not move, including the refugees in particular during this period. So in my opinion, in a sense, here we have really a shock that clearly shows that how, if you stop migration, in a sense, you have a lot of cost and in terms of the distribution of resources worldwide, you have a lot of shock at the detriment of migrants, unfortunately. Now, maybe just, I agree completely with the fact that maybe the theoretical framework is too comprehensive in a way, is not so predictive. And yes, that's true, but maybe at the end of the book, I try to argue that some of the channels are less durable than others, at least. It seems to me that I say, okay, maybe it's, at least for the legal one, it's very clear that even if we have some studies today showing mainly on the undocumented, you've mentioned these studies from Bean and others actually that have been showing that maybe the undocumented status in the US is really a transmittable one, but the nationality in particular can change, and other legal status types basically they have an effect on migrants themselves, but we don't really see effects that are durable and transmittable or across the generations. So I tend to say that maybe actually their effects are huge for migrants, for this separation between migrants and natives, and including also the economic channel. Maybe I would say that they are the most important if we just focus on migrants, but that the ethno-racial ones are the most durable in a sense, because we have this kind of inheritance dynamics of this categorization that can be sometimes, that can become sometimes really crucial. What else? I really liked your questions about immigration. I have to think about it, because it seems to me that we can actually find some kind of application of the at least the three channels to the effect of migration on the sending countries. Just I was thinking about it, for instance, for the economic channel. Of course, there's the overall issue of remittances, but also we could think, and there are some studies that look at the extent to which in sending countries, we have some kind of inequality that arise from the fact that some families have migrants and some others don't have migrants. And so in some countries, actually, migrant sending families can actually have supplementary resources, namely in times of crisis. So, so here we can think about the extent to which actually migration affects the social structure within the sending country. On the legal part, of course, we could think about the dual citizenship issue, but we could also think about, I've been thinking just while you were speaking, we could think also about the fact that the extent to which the fact that you have some family abroad can also
help because of family reunion, some families in descending countries to get also access to travel and sometimes even in some cases to migration in the host country. And in a way, so we can here think about it, or even just permit to travel much more easily than other families that don't have migrants. And lastly, about the ethno-racial channel, I think in the book, I have already, I think, used some literature that tries to think about the effect of migration on ethno-racial dynamics in descending countries, mainly using this idea of the fact that categories actually travel also with the migrants somehow. And so sometimes migrants that they come back to their home country with different categories related, for instance, to the interpretation of markers such as skin color or other, let's say, religious or cultural markers that differ from one society to another, and somehow introduce them in their home country. What can I say more? Segregation is really a tricky question. I've thought a lot about segregation because I've done myself some studies I've done some urban sociology studies, and I struggled to figure out how to, I have some kind of also, again, some discussion about segregation in the book, but not really extensively so. And I thought maybe finally I decided not to incorporate it because I thought that most of the mechanisms were not really, in my opinion, only related to migration, in a sense that segregation is a crucial mechanism of inequality, but I'm not fully convinced that it's only, it's specifically related to the ways in which, migrant can really affect this in a particular way. What else? Maybe about the opportunity hoarding concept. Yes, I agree with you that this distinction is very maybe abstract, as you said, the distinction between exploitation and opportunity hoarding. But it seems to me that it applies not so badly to the three channels, at least in the sense that my point was to say that actually the specificity of the economic channel is that okay, migrants arrive as types of workers, and so they actually somehow tends to provoke some kind of rent for employers who use them, and this rent is so by definition kind of exploitative mechanism. While for the legal and ethno-racial channel, it's difficult to think about it. It seems to me that it's really, we are at the earliest stage of inequality dynamics, in the sense that we actually create these kind of categories that by themselves distribute resources without really even integrating individuals. So I thought that maybe it's abstract in general in social stratification studies, but in this case it's quite instructive and it applies quite well to these three channels. But I might be wrong. Maybe other. I try again to also discuss the extent to which, for instance, legal categories are also used in the labor market as a source of exploitation. So I try also to nuance my distinction here, but I found it maybe it allows me to sketch these ideal typical mechanisms and separate them. For me, analytically, it's still useful, but I'm convinced that in empirical research, it's very difficult to really separate them in a clear-cut way.
Okay,
yes,
thank you.
Here and collect other questions, yes.
Yes, thank you. So we have questions from the floor, and I would like to invite Dr. Won Ju Choi, who has a question.
Oh, yeah. Nice to meet you. I'm from Korea. My dissertation focused on inequality of migration workers in Korea. So can I share my monitor?
Well, perhaps just for the sake of time, we could just pose a question. We have several other questions in the queue.
Oh, so yeah, in Korea, migrant workers prohibited their family invitation or immigration with family is prohibited. So I wrote that, pointed my dissertation, and then I did, and then I did case study in France. So I know the French priority, the family reunification. So, but nowadays, it is very strict, more strict, and then many conditions. And how about thing in France's low skill workers inequality? 모르겠다. 좀 해줘 와서.
Are you asking about how France treats low skilled versus high skilled workers?
Oh, wait a minute. My son, help it.
Oh, sorry. Hello, doctors, and I'm her son Alex, and I graduated from UC Santa Barbara. So I will just work as a translator.
그다음에 이거 있다. 내 소개도 제대로.
So she's a PhD in multicultural and diversity from Dongguk University in Korea, and she would like to thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful, and she wanted to share that a lot of the information that was written in Migration and Inequality overlaps with their dissertation, which focuses on inequality of migration workers in Korea, especially the ones from Southeast Asia.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much. I don't know if there's a question there, but
yeah, and then she would like to share her shortened version of English version of her dissertation sample to you, if that is okay.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. So one of the big questions about migration and inequality is this work by Anthony Richmond, which was quite generative back in the mid 1990s, the so-called global apartheid. And I'm wondering what you think of that concept, Mirna, if that's something that you deal with in your book, if that's the argument that the purpose of migration control and admissions policies around the world is deliberately to enforce a kind of international caste system.
Yes, I mean, I do use some kind of, maybe not this book, but I use some, I mean, I tend to use most possible also empirical work and the most up to date, at least to my knowledge. So in this regard, I've used actually the works from economists mainly on income inequality in general globally, and the effect of migration and border control on inequality. But I don't really, I mean, I didn't, maybe, I don't know if your question was, do I use like a global let's say racial inequality framework worldwide? Is it like this question that you want to ask?
Well, no, just what is your reaction to that? I mean, that is, I'm not advocating that view, but that is a strong view among people who think about migration and inequality at a macro level. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about
my thought is, I mean, I tend to think that things cannot be organized in a perfect way. I do think that actually the use of let's say of border control is like policy that has been increasing and increasingly militarized and increasingly let's say considered as somehow inevitable in a lot of democracies because of a lot of also of political pressure inside these democracies. I don't think about like external macro factors that will lead the world to be organized in a separatist way, but we have these kind of let's say of processes of especially, I'm not a political science, but especially in policy implementation, where we see actually societies really using these policies even without any kind of clear evaluation of their effects in relation to the targets that they actually claim that they want to tackle, and namely here just the numbers of migrants, right? So yeah, I tend to think this way. I mean, more like in a disorganized way rather than overall, let's say, yeah, organized domination, let's say.
Other questions?
Sorry. Okay, so I can ask a question. Hi, Mirna. So I have a question really about the first new research project that you presented, and here I guess my question has to do in a way about related to the particularities of the French situation. I mean, if one looks at France in more comparative, a global perspective, it's a country characterized by relatively low levels of immigration. I mean, low levels of immigration than its neighbors in Europe, and certainly than in North America. And also, it's a migration characterized by a low level of selectivity. I mean, for the most part, it's family reunification, and France has been very different from, let's say, the UK or Canada, Australia, the United States, and much lower receptivity to high-skilled migrants. And last, there's a high, I mean, coming back to the segregation theme, a relatively high level of geographic concentration, so not much dispersal across the national territory. So I wonder to what extent those characteristics come into play in your research. To what extent do these findings, especially regarding the impact of nativity, are related to the distinct characteristics of the French situation? I guess, and the last is, I mean, that is, given the relatively low level of immigration, again, in comparative perspective, as well as the long-standing nature, especially of the migration from North Africa, to what extent are you missing I mean, in focusing on the migrants, to what extent are you missing distinctive effects associated with the second and now the obviously growing third generation population, which I would think is an increasingly large share of the broadly categorized foreign origin population?
Yeah, so yeah, this is a very good question. So I tend in the book to really, let's say, stick to a definition of migration that is really close to the first generation, right? I discuss sometimes, because I think we can discuss a lot to what extent the second generation is actually a concept that is just referring to some kind of ethno-racial dynamics related to migration, but we're not really discussing migration effects anymore, in a sense, for me. But so in that work, in what I've been doing on the labor market, I try just to look at the migrant workers and how actually they affect the structure of the wages in workplaces, for instance. And so this is let's say the easy answer, but actually I have also to admit that the data does not have information about second generation in that case. But maybe what you were referring to, I mean, it's very complicated in France. We have only the labor survey where we have the second generation. And now the good news is that finally it seems, but I think there will be some kind of additional legal, we'll see. But it seems that we will manage to include to use a question on the second generation in the census in France in the next census. So we've been struggling. Actually, it's been like more than 30 or 40 years that we've been struggling to include this question in the census in France, because we don't have any kind of other alternative way of measuring diversity and ethnic and racial categories, other than actually accepting to go through migration somehow and go to the second generation. And now this would be added to the French census if there's no additional, let's say, legal stages. For the moment, the decision has been positive from the authorization. We got the authorization from the Public Institute in France. So yes, just maybe this is also, the question also reminds me somehow of one question of Andrés with regard the predictiveness, and we have also to I think it's a good point that we have also to to provide some kind of comparative figures about the magnitude of the effect in a sense. So for instance, just to be very clear, if you look at the migrant effects in on the individual level, okay, in France, for instance, clearly the data shows that once you control for class, I mean here occupation, detailed occupation in workplaces and gender, the migrant effect is very small, okay, and migrant status is small in comparison to the gender and the occupational status. And this is not really what I'm claiming. I'm not saying that migration is decisive to earning inequality in that perspective, from an explanatory perspective, as an individual characteristics. I'm trying to look at what actually migrant workers do at the workplace in terms of the, how they actually affect the configuration of the distribution of wages. Just by saying, okay, to what extent once you control for these individual characteristics, you still see some kind of configuration, and namely the most important result here is that, yes, in workplaces, you tend to see that workplaces that are, let's say, unequal on the gender dimension tend to be more equal on the migrant dimension, on the migration dimension. While this is something that we don't see, for instance, with regard, if we look at the relation between the gender gap and the class gap, or the gender gap and other unobserved characteristics. So it seems that there's something that actually, we discuss in the paper the different mechanisms that can be at stake, but migration can in workplaces, let's say, create some kind of different configuration of inequality along other categories of inequality. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question. The French case is also, yes, very particular, because we have, I mean, even in comparison to the European context, I always say that, France is very particular even within Europe. Yes, you're right, we don't have like high flows of migrants, but actually we have a very old migration. And this is why maybe in France in particular migration, and this is something also that Andrés maybe mentioned here, I try to also answer these questions. In France in particular, migration is becoming much more, I mean, the ethno-racial dimension of migration is more salient than in other countries, including European countries, because of the old waves of migration, but also because migration is tied to colonial history in France. And in that regard, the French case is very particular. But at the same time, if you look currently at the empirical work in Europe that compares the attainment of migrants in different countries in Europe, you see actually mostly that you have, let's take again a very standard, and I'm sorry, very maybe reductive measurement, the wage gap. You still see, roughly speaking, in all European countries, small wage gaps once you control for other characteristics, if you're just looking at the migrant status. But if you control things such as, for instance, Muslim religion, you see actually much more important gaps. And also if you look at experimental studies that really measures discrimination, here you have really huge effects of, for instance, religion. In not only in France, we tend to think that in France it's very strong, but it has been also very strong in other European countries. So this is a difference between, I think, the French and the European and the US context here. It seems that migration is somehow creating an ethno-racial dynamic around religion much more than the case in the US.
Okay.
If I can abuse the moderator privilege here, it seems really quite tricky to make any predictive claims about the relationship between migration and inequality, because you see the main directions of those relationships in such opposite directions sometimes, depending on the context. So I'm thinking, for example, in Latin America, historically, there was an effort to whiten the population by importing Europeans. Some places were successful at that, some places weren't successful in their own terms. But where successful, that was to increase all kinds of racial inequality in the society. And by contrast, if you look at the countries of the Gulf of the GCC, for example, the argument has been made that massive importation of migrant workers is a way to pay for these very generous social rights in the society, and thus reduce inequality, at least among the native-born population, even if it's, you know, at the expense of various other kinds of stratification among workers and between different kinds of workers, and the native-born population. So, you know, that would be the opposite kind of a relationship between migration and inequality. So, you know, I just bring this up because it seems like such an ambitious work, and I see why, you know, Andrés said there wasn't a lot of prediction in the book, because these relationships really are so context dependent.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're summarizing a bit what I've been saying also in the book, but I completely agree that it's not like satisfactory conclusion, let's say, of a social science inquiry, in a sense, to say that migration is just, you know, it's so complex, and so it's a lot of, you know, it provokes so much of heterogeneous effects that we can't measure anything. I still think that there are some stylized facts, but my point is that we have to scrutinize really the channels to think about, you know, we have to have these kind of cumulative approaches where we try to tackle one important mechanism, one important channel, and contribute to the literature. To be able to unfold all the configuration. But yeah, it depends a lot. For instance, with regard to the ethno-racial channel, I argue that it depends a lot on the existing classification in each society, and this differs even in our globalized world. I mean, the markers, the interpretation of the markers, their salience in social interactions are different from one context to another. And then accidentally, some migrants can have, you know, some characteristics that can have some meanings in some settings and some other meaning in some others, right? So we never really know, but what is clear is that migration is potentially something that can affect existing racial orders in societies. And that's my point. And then I try just to summarize all what we know out of the literature from these different dynamics. But I fully agree that, yeah, it's not predictive, in a sense that I don't have a straightforward, unique answer to these very complex questions.
Chetin.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Çetin Çelik. I'm connecting to the meeting from Istanbul. So I have a question about the paper you are working on, Professor Safi, on French context. I'm curious what sort of differences you had a chance to observe concerning reactions of people to these ethno-racial hierarchies in France, because you know, there are labor migrants who moved there as of 1960s, but also people coming from old colonial states. So there are religious differences, religious sect differences, and so on. The way they struggle with these ethno-racial hierarchies by birth, and you know, then getting the citizenship. Are they sort of converging into each other, or do they follow different strategies to claim equality? Basically, I'm here referring to Andreas Wimmer and Michel Lamont's studies. You know, people are confronting with ethno-racial hierarchies, but develop some ways to deal with them. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So, are you asking me if different waves of migrants are somehow
responding to these ethno-racial hierarchies differently?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And what maybe a very interesting example, but sorry, again, maybe it's not telling for somebody who does not know the context. In France, we have the overseas, what we call the overseas migrants, who are actually migrants of dark skin color, tend to be black actually, and these are actually descendant of African slaves at the time of the colonization in the overseas, the Caribbean specifically, and also in other area in the world. And these migrants are black, and we have also these are native minorities, but they have what's really strikingly interesting in the French case is that these are native minorities in the sense that they were colonized a very long time ago, and then they became fully citizens, and all of them are born with the French citizenship, and they live today in a department that is a French department. But they also migrated to mainland France. There has been some kind of important wave of migration of these overseas migrants to mainland France, actually in a similar period to the migration from actually North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So you have these kind of different migrants, and I'm here referring me just to try to answer your question to, for instance, those who are Black. You have those who come from Africa and those who come from the overseas. And they have different citizenship status and different and of course they arrive from different places, but we don't see, on the contrary, what's interesting is that to look at the boundaries between them, and we see here things that resemble sometimes the ways in which Black in the US think about other migrant minorities, in the sense that they also use a lot their citizenship status to differentiate them from the migrants, mainly the undocumented also migrants. In that case, in France, for instance, overseas migrants will really distinguish themselves from other migrants, including Black ones, and even deny somehow any kind of, tend to not really to commit to like Black identity, while so you don't have, my point here is that you don't have actually similar claim making, because actually these people have some kind of ethno-racial markers that we could perceive as similar. Now, what about other markers such as, for instance, religion? We also have a diversity of Muslim population coming to Europe today. And doesn't seem, maybe something else is happening around the Muslim non-Muslim boundary in Europe. Something else is happening in the sense that it's currently under, in progress, in a sense. We have like a boundary building today that is very, very impressive and present in the political discourse everywhere in Europe today, which makes this topic so salient, and which makes this identity also so much assigned somehow from externally to some people that maybe don't completely identify religiously. And so maybe here the dynamics would be more towards like some kind of what we could call ethnicization. So people will really feel that they belong to this minority in a sense because of the common expression or experience of inequality, discrimination, and stigmatization. But I'm being very speculative here. But this is something that we see, for instance, in France. If you look at the survey, the latest survey about religious identity, we see actually an increase within the Muslim population across the generation. We measured actually an increase in identification to Islam in comparison to earlier generation.
Right. Well, thank you very much. We are unfortunately at time. So I would like to once again thank Professor Safi for joining us on a Friday night, to Professor Villarreal for sharing his expertise, and invite everyone to join us next Friday as we discuss the new book by Andrea Wright. Have a good weekend, everyone.